All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Coffee with a Codex. I'm filling in for my colleague Dot Porter. My name is Nicholas Herman. I'm the Lawrence J. Schoenberg Curator at the Schoenberg Institute for Manuscript Studies and an occasional, as I said, guest participant for Coffee with a Codex. And I'm joined here by my colleague Amy Hutchins, and it's great to see everyone else on the call. Today we are looking at a book of hours, a genre you may be familiar with, but if you're not, this is a type of prayer book used very frequently in the later Middle Ages and in the early modern period or Renaissance by lay persons, so people in Europe who were not ordained as monks or priests, but who wanted to be able to say prayers on a regular basis. And so these books are a kind of devotional aid, very popular at the time. There are many thousands that survive. And we have a number of examples in our collection at Penn. There are some very splendid and famous books of ours in libraries around the world. Ours are perhaps a little bit less well known, but still interesting in their own right. The book I'm going to show you today is from Renaissance Italy, specifically from Venice, from the later 15th century or early 16th century. So it's a relatively late book of hours, and it's relatively unusual because we don't have all that many Italian books of hours compared to ones from Northern Europe. There's a wonderful database and website online run by a scholar named Francesca Manzari that tracks Italian books of hours. There are several hundred, I think, perhaps over 500 that have been accounted for, but that compares to sort of tens of thousands that survive from Northern Europe, principally from France and the Netherlands, which created books of hours in large numbers for export to other places in Europe. So it's relatively unusual that we have an Italian example. This one is unillustrated. So many books of ours are famous for their illuminations. This one doesn't have any illuminations, but as I hope to show you, it is interesting nonetheless. And this manuscript, as you can see, and I'll be very careful with the exterior, is a little bit fragile. Its spine and front cover are actually loose, which seems alarming, but is actually, in a way, somewhat common for us and for books of this age. And you can see that it has a gilt stamped motif on the binding. This is a later binding, I would say probably from the 17th century, just going on the style of the stamped designs. You can see there's a kind of oval design. And let me see if I can focus in a little bit better. That might be a little better. And you can see that there are remnants of clasps here. These are little rivets that would have attached clasps to hold the volume shut. And you can see that the leather along the edge of the spine has deteriorated and it is actually loose. So the spine and the front cover are actually loose, but try not to be too bothered by that. The books with loose elements like this can be handled safely if they're handled carefully. And we can see actually that this book, and I'm going to sort of move the cover aside in a moment to be able to handle it a little bit better. It has some interesting provenance notes. It has the University of Pennsylvania stamp. This is its older call number. This is its modern present day shelf mark, MS Codex 688, which I think I should have mentioned at the beginning. Now I'm going to try to focus in a little bit more. There we go. And you can see that there are some signatures. There's something written in pencil here, MS of the 16th century by an Italian scribe, gift of Edwin H. Federholf, who I believe was an architect in Philadelphia. And here we have a book plate. It's also quite loose. The Gift of Jacob Riegel Jr., September 28th, 1934. So I think that Jacob Riegel perhaps gave it to Edwin Federholf, who gave it to the University of Pennsylvania. But we actually have some earlier provenance, which is sort of interesting. Someone here, John C. Jackson, 1849, which is sort of interesting. Here, the name is repeated. So John C. Jackson, from what we can tell, was a schoolmaster in England, born in 1827. So if he owned this book in 1849, he was, in his 20s when he had it. A schoolmaster and noted book collector. There are many books with this signature that have since circulated in the book market and can be found at places like the Morgan Library and elsewhere. But interestingly, there was a sale of his books in 1895 after he died. But this book, we know, was actually in the hands of Philadelphian before that. We have a pencil inscription here. This book of ours was purchased in Florence, Italy, about 1875 by the Reverend William Eli D.D. of Philadelphia. So this above is all the information obtainable, which is an interesting thing. So this looks like maybe a perhaps early 20th century person writing what they knew about the book. And this Reverend Eli was a minister in Philadelphia in the late 19th century. So if he bought this book in Florence, if that's true, John Jackson somehow had it in England, and then it made its way to Florence through the book trade by 1875, perhaps. These ownership notes we have to sometimes take with a grain of salt. Who is Belinda? Somebody asks in the chat. There is a Belinda here in gold ink, and that is a mystery. The style of that writing looks like it could be sort of maybe from the 18th century or thereabouts. Maybe we can do some more research on that. Maybe we'll never know. But these ownership inscriptions are sometimes very helpful and then sometimes kind of puzzling, and raise more questions than they answer. So here we have the first parchment page of the Book of Hours. So previously these are later paper flyleaves. This is the parchment section, the main section of the Book of Hours, which starts, like most books of hours, with a calendar. And here you can see right away that this is a very different script than most Northern European books of hours. This is an Italian Humanist script. So this is a script that is developed really in the early 15th century in an effort to sort of modernize script by going back to older examples. So it takes elements from Carolingian minuscule, a sort of high medieval script that was thought to be closer to sort of a Roman kind of ancient way of writing. And it's very clean and very sort of can be very beautiful. This is written by a very competent scribe, and we'll see in the main body of the book even more. But this Humanist script is relatively unusual for a book of hours, although by this period, more and more books of hours are being written in this script and indeed printed in type of this style. Now, this is different from the Gothic script used in Italy. So Italy and Southern Europe had its own kind of regional variation of Gothic script called Rotunda, where the kind of Northern Gothic is sort of rounded out. But this, though it has elements of that, is a different type of script, this Humanist script. And we can sort of, we'll be able to see that a little clearer as we move into the book. Now, like most calendars, we can look for interesting and unusual saints that might tell us a little bit about where the book was made. So some of these saints are sort of universal, but we have ones that are less universal. So here, December 7th, Ambrose, who is Bishop of Milan, relatively popular saint because he's one of the church fathers. But if we also go back to, let's see, the 1st of June, or am I? Yes, we have up here Secundus of Asti, unusual saint, Asti in northern Italy. And then on the 7th of November, Prodocimus of Padua. Let's go to the 7th of November, and here we go. Prodocimus of Padua. And you'll also see that there have been a number of additional saints' days added in, sometimes doubling up. And there's a note here that seems to be in the hand that added these saints that says the additions are from the Yorktown 1663. So I think that this owner, an English owner, maybe this John Jackson, maybe someone else, is referring back to a printed book from the 17th century, an English book printed in the 17th century to fill in some of the additional saint days. I see a question about the KL. That's calends. That's the abbreviation of just calendar in Latin, and that is typically found in the upper left corner of a calendar page. And we are seeing wormholes, which very astute of you to pick that up from the overhead camera. And these wormholes, as you can see, right, they traverse the parchment, and then they kind of, a few of them sort of peter out. So the worm sort of stopped, turned around. I don't know, got hungry, got less hungry, had his or her fill. And that's sort of relatively unusual with parchment because generally insects are not attracted to parchment. They're more attracted to wood. And you can see that some of the insect holes go through the wood. So this was in a very wormy or insect-ridden environment for some time. Now, the most interesting feast day is in October. And there's a great web tool called, I think it's called Corpus Calendarium, that you can use you enter the dates in a calendar that you come across, and it'll show you which other books of hours have similar calendars. Now, what we have here in October, the 8th of October is an unusual feast. This is the dedication of Saint Mark. And what that is, it's not the feast day of Saint Mark, who was one of the evangelists. It's the dedication of the Basilica of San Marco in Venice. And so that one only finds really in books of hours made either in Venice, for Venice, or for users who were connected to Venice. So that's sort of an interesting element. And I'll show you shortly some other elements that confirm that localization to Venice. Okay, so that's enough for the calendar. This is the first page of the Hours of the Virgin, which comes after the calendar, and very fine parchment, very finely prepared parchment. This D and this little ornament are sort of unusual because they're kind of disconnected. The D, they may be added later. They may be an attempt at the sort of beginning of decoration, but they're the only sort of large-scale decorations found in the book. And indeed, other areas have blank spaces left for the initials, which were never completed. So this is not a complete decorative program. This would have been much more profusely illustrated had it been completed. And we actually have a lot of books from this period which were never fully decorated, which may have had been planned to accommodate decoration, but were never fully decorated. So I hope you can see as well here we have very sort of delicate gilded initials that alternate with blue initials. And I hope you can see even with the fluorescent overhead lights we have here. Let me try to refocus that. You can see a little bit of the effect from the gilding. And as you can see more in the gilded and in the blue letters, those are capitals, right? These are Roman capitals that are very different from Gothic capitals, whereas the minuscule text, though it's in this humanist hand, still has elements of the Gothic, but these letters are totally within that sort of geometric schema that dictates how letters are formed in a system that is similar to our Times New Roman as we would know it today, where there are radii, right, that dictate the curvature of certain elements, and for example, the serifs. And in this period in Italy, in the Renaissance, there are treatises, there are books printed that show you the kind of geometric logic of these letters. So we have here the prayers for the 8 hours of the day, the canonical hours that are typical or that are integral to the hours of the Virgin, these prayers to be recited throughout the day. We have things like catchwords here that run downwards, and those simply allow the person binding the book to match up the end of one gathering or choir of bifolia with the next one. So here we have stele and stele. The scribe is simply indicating what the first word on the next sheaf or gathering of folios is. And I did notice earlier something interesting, which you sometimes have to look out for in books. Here we have in cello, and here we have semper, a different word. So something is missing here. Perhaps a leaf has been torn out, or a whole gathering is missing. But what we also have down here, and I don't know if you can see, there's a tiny little marking, and it's been cut off in a later rebinding of the manuscript, or perhaps an original rebinding. But here you have it more distinct. It's not been cut off. This is a C2, C3. Is there another one? Cut off, but that would be C4. And what that is telling you, really the binder, it's not meant for the person, the end user of the book. This is meant to help in the production process, is telling you that this is gathering C, A, B, C. So it's the third gathering, and this is the first leaf, or first bifolio, second bifolio, third bifolio, fourth bifolio, and this is the middle. And then here we would have had a C5 that's been totally cut off. Then we have the middle of the gathering. I can see a string in here, but I won't force it to show you. And then we would have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And that takes us to the end of the next. This is a quinion. So it's a 5 bifolio, 10 leaf, 20 page gathering. But again, we have the catchword, and it doesn't match up here. So we're missing sections of this book, which can happen. I don't believe there would have been illustrations that have been cut out, although sometimes you do get that in books of hours. People cut out the beautiful pages and sell them or frame them separately. Here we're back on track, though, because we have honorabile and honorabile here. Now, we have the end of the hours of the Virgin Mary here, a couple of blank folios. They're ruled. Somebody mentioned in the chat there, you can see the ruling. It's very faint, but it's ruled with ink. And then we have a mass, so some prayers for mass. And here you can see this is an initial S that someone has written in pencil later on, but this is intended for an illuminated initial. And next section, the 7 Psalms, again, a D here that hasn't been filled in. And we have those Psalms. We have what's called a litany, University of Pennsylvania Library stamp. We don't do that anymore, but that is an older practice. And we have this litany is basically a list of saints that one prays for. And sometimes you have unusual saints here as well. And I believe somewhere here we have Ludovique, which is interesting because Louis is a French saint, and the early 16th century of the French occupation of parts of northern Italy and Venice. And so perhaps that's related to that. So then we have shorter offices. So these are like the Hours of the Virgin, but much shorter. One is dedicated to the cross, and there's another one dedicated to the Holy Spirit. And again, they have spaces allotted for initials that were never finished. But the kind of most interesting part of this book, from a historical perspective, is at the end. So the book is in Latin, as are most books of hours. And these sections of text are pretty normal. They're encountered in a lot of books of hours. But what we have at the end of this book of hours is, if not unique, at least quite unusual, because we have prayers that switch into Italian. And you can see that there's a lot of text in red, right? Let me see if I can zoom in a little bit. This is a rubric. This is not part of the prayer. This is instructions as to what you're supposed to do. And this is interesting because these instructions tell the owner of the book how to say the prayer or when to say it. And this one is for Sundays, certain Sundays. And it says, avanti che tu mangi ne bevi, before you eat or drink. Sta avanti el crucifixo, be in front of a crucifix. Con la faccia levata dretto, with your face pointing straight, or, respectfully. Zonte le mani, with hands joined. And so there are a set of prayers here that are in Latin, but the prayers are also in Italian, but the instructions are almost as long as the prayers, and they're different instructions for how you should position yourself and your limbs and your body in front of a cross, and how you should have a candle and sometimes the candle should be snuffed out in remembrance of Christ's death. So you have these kind of interesting indications. And even more interesting is that if you know a little bit of modern Italian and a little bit of the history of the Italian language, right? Modern Italian is based on the Tuscan dialect that becomes standardized throughout Italy, but only really in the 19th and 20th centuries. This is not standard Italian. There are things like there are Z's and X's and things, and this is a Venetian dialect. it's pretty clearly a Venetian dialect, and particularly the instructions as opposed to the prayers, which are in a kind of more standardized Tuscan. So, of course, that just reinforces the fact. Remember, we saw in the calendar the dedication of the uh, Basilica of St. Mark, which is specific to Venice. And here we have confirmation of that. We have some instructions for the user. And remember, these instructions are meant to be easily understandable, whereas the Latin text could be sort of arcane and difficult to follow for people in lay people in Italy who perhaps didn't have as much Latin knowledge as the clergy. These rubrics in red, and they're pretty bright red. The overhead is really not doing justice. They're bright red. They're significantly brighter than what I can see on the screen, and the gold is significantly shinier. But in any case, they are in a more understandable, call it a dialect or variant of Italian, even more localized than the prayers. So the prayers were probably based on existing prayers found in other books. But as far as I can recall, these rubrics in red are unique, or at least have not been traced to other manuscripts. And I'll read to you, I have this written out. So on Palm Sunday, the prayers are to be said while looking up with joined hands. On Mondays, with hands crossed over the knees in memory of the flagellation. On Tuesdays, at the foot of the cross, in the manner of Mary Magdalene. On Wednesdays, prostrate and face to the ground. So these are weekday instructions. You know, you do a different thing each day. And for each day, the prayers are said before breakfast. So before you eat or drink. And I think that's quite interesting because it does tell us a little bit about what the kind of ideal personal prayer attitudes would have been. Now, that somebody raised in the chat, this book looks, despite the deteriorated cover and binding, it has not been heavily used as far as we can tell. It's in pretty good condition. So one wonders, how much were these instructions followed? But it raises a lot of interesting questions. So, who would have written or composed these? Is it some kind of spiritual advisor? Is it really unique to this book, or are there other examples of the same or similar instructions? And then we switch back here to Latin. So interesting that we go from the Italian, the Venetian dialect for the instructions, to a more standard Italian, back to Latin. And then I think we have no further instructions. Yes. So altogether, a pretty interesting book. We know that we have the end. We have finis written here. So this is not a catchword. This is kind of colophon, or just the word, the end, indicating that there's nothing left. So we know from some of the mismatched catchwords that we're missing a few pages or gatherings from the book, but we know that we have the end of it. And so that's MS Codex 688, Book of Hours from Venice from around the year 1500. And that takes us just about to 12:30. So I want to thank you all for attending. And I will not be here next week, but I will be joining you in a few weeks' time, I think in May, to present a very special new acquisition. So thank you all, and have a nice day.